Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone, and my co-host is Caitlin Drake. Before we begin, I'd like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. Today, our guest is Senior Pastor at Boston Avenue Church, the Reverend David Wiggs. We'll be talking about some developments that have emerged over the summer in the United Methodist world as progressive and moderate churches respond to the decisions made at the February special session of the General Conference. Welcome, Reverend Wiggs.
Thank you, Philip. Great to be with you today.
So just a quick recap. In May, you, Senior Pastor Reverend David Wiggs, attended the UMC Next Conference in Kansas City.
Yes, I did.
And we recorded an episode of Ascends with you pretty much right after that. So for those who are listening along at home, they can go and find that in our archives if they're interested in the details of that gathering. And then out of that meeting emerged what has more or less been termed a resistance movement. And then just a few weeks ago, you attended the Leadership Institute at the Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City. And this particular Leadership Institute was focused around this issue in our denomination. And then finally, that we'll touch on towards the end of this podcast, we've been planning some actions specifically at our church around this conversation. So following the conference in May, we had kind of talked about 4 commitments made at that conference. So one was to reclaim or rearticulate our Wesleyan theology around tradition, experience, and reason when interpreting Scripture. Recommitting to our baptismal vows of resisting evil, injustice, and oppression in all forms and toward all people, and build a church which affirms the full participation of all. Rejecting wholly the traditional plan, and then working to eliminate discriminatory language within our denomination. So did you see a continuation of these themes or these commitments in the conversation at Leadership Institute last month?
Yes, there is a continuation for sure of that discussion. In May, there were approximately 600 people representing United Methodist churches and annual conferences from across the U.S., primarily from across the U.S. And this last one, at the end of September, there was nearly 2,500 people participating. So the conversation did continue. It focused a little more on the upcoming General Conference. So the next General Conference is coming in May 2020. The deadline for legislation or petitions to that General Conference had just passed just a few days before we met in Kansas City. So there was a little more discussion about what kind of path forward it might, what kind of options are there going to be presented at the General Conference. A little discussion about what it means to lead in churches that are divided or in annual conferences that are divided over the issue of how we're going to treat LGBTQ people in our midst. But definitely continuing those core themes and discussions specifically in terms of gathering people who want a more inclusive United Methodist Church than the traditional plan calls for.
Where are we seeing progress in terms of these 4 commitments? Did the Leadership Institute provide updates or insight into movement around these 4 commitments?
I think certainly the commitment to Wesleyan theology is a primary one, and what it means to be in a denomination that historically has taken the position that we don't all have to agree to be a part of the family of faith, and Wesley's dictum about in essentials unity and in non-essentials liberty and in all things charity, sort of reaffirming, not that they were giving speeches exactly on that phrase, but affirming that kind of theological or denominational stance in terms of how we treat issues when we have differences. Certainly the idea of resistance is continuing to be an important theme as we're coming up upon when the traditional plan, as voted last February, actually becomes the law of the church, so to speak, on January 1, 2020. So certainly that part. And then also just the whole idea of full participation of people, specifically out of the LGBTQ community, in the life of the church, whether it be a local church or an annual conference or a general conference or whatever.
So you mentioned a resistance movement. Can you talk a little bit more about what has emerged as part of that?
Sure. That didn't get hardly any time at the Church of the Resurrection Leadership Institute meeting in September. But to me, it's one of the more important developments because, again, it's a movement from across the country, leaders, clergy leaders, denominational leaders, lay leaders from across the denomination who are working together, basically under the title of Faithful Resistance. What does it mean to be people of faith and yet resist what the denomination will have as its kind of ruling legislation, at least temporarily, beginning in January? So out of that, there's a focus on the months from January 1st, 2020 until General Conference in May of 2020. Each month will have a theme. January will be resist. February will be love. March will be lament during the season of Lent. April will be liberation, and May will be witness. So resources are being written right now around worship and prayer, around marriage equality, around how do we deal with institutional power. So a whole variety of things are being worked on right now in terms of what does faithful resistance look like.
What can we expect to see in terms of legislation at the 2020 General Conference?
Okay, that is a little bit of a tricky question because not all that has been published yet. The deadline's passed for people to submit plans and petitions. We do know that several different ideas have been presented. It's also clear that they're not all suggesting the same thing, so there's going to be a variety of options in terms of what maybe could be voted on. They cover the gamut from everything from dissolving the denomination and dividing up the assets to restructuring the denomination into 3 or 4 different constituent groups, but somehow all still under the same umbrella of United Methodism and all relating to the same general agencies for mission or for health benefits and pensions and those kind of things. At the Church of the Resurrection Leadership Institute meeting with United Methodist Church Next leadership as a part of that, they did present a plan that's a series of petitions. So rather than being in a single plan, so some of the legislation is covering a lot of different topics in a single proposal. Others have chosen to write individual petitions addressing a variety of things. What they were calling the Next Generation United Methodist Church, they had a series of petitions. So they want to pass a petition that puts a moratorium on all charges that might be levied under the traditional plan. They also have a petition repealing the traditional plan. They have another one recommending we remove all restrictive language. Also another one repealing all the restrictions on funding in terms of being in ministry with LGBTQ people. It redefines and specifies some of the barriers that we're working to eliminate from the United Methodist Church in terms of LGBTQ exclusion. And then they're also proposing a commission to actually restructure the whole denomination in terms of infrastructure, which is a longer term look, but has become apparent during these most recent debates around LGBTQ that our hierarchy has probably become unwieldy and our current connectional polity is really not functional in terms of what it means to be a global church. It was really designed to be a U.S. form of organization, and now we're a global organization, but we haven't really changed our structure to deal with that. And so the Next Generation United Methodist Church Next folks are calling for that to be addressed and assigned to a special committee. And they're even going to recommend, I think they've submitted this petition, that there be another special called General Conference just to deal with the structure. Now, whether or not anybody wants another special General Conference that costs millions of dollars and sometimes doesn't produce anything, I'm not sure. But you can just see the variety of options that are going to be presented at General Conference for the delegates to consider.
So we can safely say that even though the 2019 conference was supposed to be the definitive endpoint for this conversation, that really all it has done is prolonged the conversation further.
It has prolonged it, but I think it's done more than that. I think the purpose it served, even though I wasn't in favor of the outcome that was voted on, it did crystallize that there's some change that needs to be made. Now, clearly we don't all agree on which way the change should move, but it's really clear that we're in a different place. And I think with the passing of the traditional plan, it really activated United Methodists from across the U.S. who just assumed, and I think I probably fall in this category, that of course Methodists would be reasonable and we would make room for everybody even though we didn't agree. When we adopted the traditional plan, we moved from what I would call sort of a foundation of grace in terms of how we function to these mandatory sentences and purposeful, exclusive restrictions, mandatory sentences in terms of removing people from ministry. So I think it was really clarified for people, not only do we have disagreements about how we ought to deal with human sexuality and particularly inclusion of LGBTQ people, but we really have a different view on what kind of church organization and government we want. And I think that's going to be the longer conversation is as we go forward, how will we align ourselves and will we all stay together? Probably not. How that division or realignment happens is still not clear.
And we've seen a lot of churches who wouldn't have necessarily termed themselves progressive, but would be more in the moderate camp, kind of join this coalition in resistance to the traditional plan for some of the reasons that you pointed out.
Yes, for sure. I think there were a lot of people in the middle, and still I'd have to say in my discussions from Methodists across our state and this region, there are a lot of people that are still hoping that they don't really have to take a stand and they never really will have to discuss this in their local church. I've come to the point of thinking that everybody's going to have to discuss it and everyone's going to have to clarify their own position on this. It's sort of the watershed issue, I think, of our generation or of our time. And I don't think it's really an option if you're going to be vitally involved in the United Methodist Church or the Methodist movement to have no opinion at this point.
What organizing work is being done in Oklahoma going forward?
There's a whole variety of things. There were 10 Oklahomans at the meeting that happened back in May. There were over 60 at the meeting that happened in September. So I think there is a growing movement in Oklahoma of, as Caitlin was saying, moderates and progressives who feel like the traditional plan pushed us way too far to the right and to restrictions and moved us away. We've always dealt with disagreements within our denomination with some kind of just resolution or due process. And when the vote came to have mandatory sentences and mandatory suspensions, I think that woke a lot of people up in a way that they were not happy that their denomination had taken that step, despite however they might feel about LGBTQ inclusion. And so I think that really has activated a more active conversation across this area. So anyway, our church, Boston Avenue Church, and others are organizing to take steps to be more inclusive. Some are engaging in the Reconciling Ministries Network process to become reconciling congregations. So we've just had a couple of churches in Oklahoma finish up that process that had not been a part of that before. There are more groups of people meeting, discussing how are we going to function as United Methodist in light of the traditional plan coming into, full force in January. The fact that one of our local churches here in Oklahoma, right here in Tulsa, Asbury United Methodist, is hosting the global, as they call their group, the Global Wesleyan Covenant Association meeting. I think that's going to bring more attention to, they're the main group that supported the restrictions. They've spent a lot of time and money to enforce a particular kind of plan and exclusive kind of stance on LGBTQ issues and people, whether it happens to have to do with same-gender weddings or who's a qualified candidate for ministry or who can be in ministry. So I think that's going to bring even more light to sort of the issues at stake at this point.
So pivoting a little bit to that gathering that's going to be here in Tulsa, that's coming up in November. What is being done as a, I guess, kind of a response to that, to balance that message that they're sending? What efforts are being made to send a different message?
Right. So since it's here in Tulsa, and I disagree with the direction they're going, as do a number of Oklahoma clergy and Methodist lay leadership, we're going to be hosting a prayer vigil on that same Saturday that they're having their gathering. That's Saturday, November 9th. We'll be hosting a prayer vigil here at the United Methodist Church, at Boston Avenue Church, where we'll be affirming that everyone's a beloved child of God, praying for full inclusion, praying for, in our opinion, more love and grace to reign in our dealings with each other. And so that'll be on Saturday, November 9th, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. here at the church. At 1 o'clock or halfway through that 12-hour period, we'll stop and have a worship service together. It's open to the public, and anybody who might want to be supportive of inclusion in their church, whether they're Methodist or not. It'll be an hour of prayer and worship around those issues.
So for folks who are looking to get involved with that event, they can learn more about it by visiting our website or looking at our Facebook page. And the event is going to be called Beloved, affirming that everyone is a beloved child of God. So you can check out www.bostonavenue.org/beloved or our Facebook page and look for that event there.
Right. And, we just had a meeting here at Boston Avenue on Sunday, October 13th. People who wanted to talk about resistance on a regional level, as well as what steps they might want to take in their own local churches or in their own individual lives. There's 2 other meetings coming up, one in Oklahoma City and one in Lawton. Actually, I think the one in Oklahoma City happened yesterday based on when this podcast is coming out. The one in Lawton is going to be on the 24th, I understand, of October. But there'll be continuing meetings that we'll be publicizing for people who want to be more involved in not only resistance to the traditional plan, but to be a part of discussions about how do we lead with grace and love, how do we listen for God's call in people's lives based on their gifts and grace for ministry, which has always been our criteria, rather than someone's sexual orientation or gender identity or some other criteria that somebody might want to add. So anyone who wants to be a part of that, they can watch for those announcements as well.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add, either about the meeting in Kansas City or about November 9th?
I think that's probably it. It would be great to have people come on the 9th, even if they can't come for the prayer vigil. There's 30-minute slots where they could sign up to pray either here at the church or wherever they're going to be at during those 30 minutes on that Saturday. But it'll be great to have a big turnout here at the church in the sanctuary for the community worship experience and prayer time together. I just think it's important that as a Methodist, as a United Methodist pastor, that the only message coming from Methodist is not one of condemnation. In my view, that's never been who we are. That's not who I am now. That's not who I want us to be. That's not who our church is. And so I think we have to become active to send a different message and make sure that people who are searching for a church or are searching for a relationship with Christ have opportunity to find it among Methodist people who are led by grace and inclusion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. To find out what's going on at the church, please come to our Facebook page. If you want to get involved with the events on November 9th, you can check it out there. And we will talk to you later. Thank you. Bye.